I'll be going through some content today and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'll say up front, usually I do these sessions with the founder of our organization because we are from different generations. So I think it kind of provides a dynamic duo, but she wasn't available today, so I'll be taking it solo. And I'm really excited to collaborate and hear your perspectives too at the end of the content. I'll say up front that today we'll be talking about differences across generations. So, what are some of the varying differences in terms of expectations for workplaces? What are some of the different communication channels or methods that different generations like and dislike? What are some of the broad trends? But I also want to say up front that these are general trends and observations. They're not necessarily facts, because I would never want to then perpetuate some kind of stereotype or bias about people of different generations. And so I think the dynamic that comes into play that's dangerous is when we take some of these trends or observations and list them as fact and then go with that and develop opportunities for some and not others, whether that's opportunities for hiring and recruitment, or whether it's workplace training and development opportunities, so on and so forth. So today we're really going to be talking about some of the observations and trends so that you can get a sense of maybe some of the ways that older adults versus newer adults in the workplace like to engage or communicate or get feedback. But I think it's important to realize that there's really flexibility here. And everyone's different. So, flexibility, I think, will be the name of the game for today. And I'll offer you some strategies of how you can support people of all different ages in the workplace. But again, realizing that the supports you provide should be tailored to the individual, no matter their age. So, just a bit of a disclaimer there. For today's agenda, we'll go through who we are, so the Diversity Institute, just so you get a feel for where we're coming from. We'll go through the case for what I'm calling EDI, so equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, because I think supporting people of all different ages in the workplace is really about inclusion. So we'll talk about why it's important. But then really the meat and the potatoes of the discussion is understanding a multi-generational workforce. So some of those trends and observations that I mentioned. We'll talk a bit about ageism, and then we'll talk about the way forward, because I would, of course, never want to give you some trends and observations without some strategies for change. We'll talk about communications, flexibility, feedback seeking, supporting differences in the workplace, what you can do as a manager, what you can do as a peer, so on and so forth. So that's what you're in for today. This is a little bit about us. So the Diversity Institute was founded in 1999. We exist in Toronto Metropolitan University within the business school. We have about 50 plus full-time staff, and we're a research institute. So what we do is really research on the experiences of people in all their diversity across domains. So that could be in healthcare, in the justice system, education, workforce, workplace, leadership, entrepreneurship, and more. And then I am the director of consulting. It's technically research special projects, but consulting at its core. And I support organizations by reviewing their policies and practices, talking to their staff, talking to their clients and communities, and then helping them embed equity and inclusion and accessibility within all of their processes. And a big part of that is capacity building. So really helping organizations understand how they can promote inclusion internally and also through the services or goods that they provide. So that was a little bit about us. Anytime I do any kind of dialogue related to inclusion, no matter the topic, so we've done work on gender equality, anti-Black racism, accessibility and disability in the workplace, and now here we're talking about multi-generational workplaces. Anytime I start with any kind of content, I think it's really important to emphasize the why. And I'm sure most of you on the line are kind of already bought into this because you've signed up. But just to give you a little bit of emphasis on the why, or maybe some talking points that you can use in your own circles if you're trying to bring this conversation forward. And what I'll say here is I have a couple of buckets, but I think it's important to note that, of course, any kind of inclusion comes with a human rights imperative and a moral imperative. But it's also good business. And if you look across any organizational strategic plan, the vision, the mission, and the values, there is a spot for inclusion to be slotted in to connect. So if you're an organization that provides services, for example, how can you ensure that your services resonate and are inclusive and accessible to people in all their diversity? From a workplace perspective, how are you attracting and retaining new and diverse talent? And that includes talent, people of all ages, In a couple of slides, we'll look at the changing demographics age-wise, but also just diversity in general. So you can see that the talent pools across Canada and across BC in particular are shifting. So how can inclusion and infusing inclusion in your efforts help you attract that talent pool? But I think it's not just about attracting that talent pool, it's also about retaining that talent pool, which brings us over to this bottom right-hand corner on increasing employee satisfaction and reducing turnover and enhancing retention. When people of all ages feel respected and valued in the workplace, they're more likely to be productive, to stay, and to bring their whole authentic self and perspective to their work. Which brings us back here, which I started off with, but really responding to the increasingly different needs of communities, no matter what the organization does. Perhaps there are people in the organization that are more forward facing and client facing. And when you have people in all their diversity working at the organization who are able to bring their lived experiences to their work, you're better placed to provide services that meet that changing pool of individuals who are your clients or communities. It helps us with innovation, creativity, and thought, diverse thought. I'll always give a personal example here that my lived experience is of a younger Black woman. I'm not someone who lives with a disability. That's not to say that I don't have a responsibility to consider accessibility in all of the decisions I'm making for my staff and for the clients we serve and support, but it's not something that is my lived experience. And so having people around the decision-making table who have those lived experiences are absolutely important. So just a personal example there. And then I think, of course, infusing inclusion into any of your efforts helps with legal and reputational risks and costs. Of course, we all have to adhere to human rights codes, but also every organization wants to be one that people want to work for. They feel like they have an opportunity to develop and thrive at, where your clients and communities know that you deliver good, inclusive services, so on and so forth. And I'll also pause here and say that in a couple of slides, we'll go through some stats on some of the expectations of younger generations, particularly Gen Z, and what they're looking for when it comes to the job market and the kinds of jobs that they want to apply for. And reputation is a really big one, as well as values alignment. So, all that to say, I won't belabor the point too much because, again, I think that everyone's mainly bought onto the case for inclusion, but some good talking points here that I think the internal and the external really support one another. And inclusion really supports you with your talent pools, your retention, client and community support, innovation, creativity of thought, and risk mitigation. I'll pause and just say that if you have any questions or comments, or you think of a point of how inclusion supports the organization that I've missed, feel free to pop it in the chat because I would love to hear your perspectives and we can get into it in about 40 minutes. Okay. So we're going to be talking about multi-generational workplaces. On the y-axis, I have the different generations we're going to be talking about. I will say up front that I'm not a huge fan of some of the terminology. I cringe a little bit to say baby boomers, but I understand that that's maybe something that's broadly known. So we'll use it for today, but just a note on terminology. And a note to say that these are not set in stone slash fact. I've seen, for example, that some people say that Gen Z is 1997 onwards, but some people say it cuts off at 2012. So the categories are always shifting. I think it kind of depends who you ask. And people don't always see themselves right in one of these boxes neatly. So you might not be someone who is, I don't know, 1950 on the dot. And so you see yourself perfectly in the middle of the baby boomer generation. Maybe you're someone who's on the cusp. I would identify as someone who's on the cusp of a millennial and Gen Z, just where my birthday falls. And so as we go through and we look at some of the trends and observations, maybe there's some that relate to you because of where you sit. And there also might just be some that relate to you because you don't fit the typical norms that we expect from different generations. I'll give a personal example. While I am someone who is perhaps on the cusp of millennial Gen Z, I only recently started online banking a couple of years ago, and I do not like two-factor authentication. So all of those, I guess, expectations of younger generations being tech savvy, I can definitely use Excel, but some of the newer tech, I'm still dipping my toes into AI. So it's just to say again that I don't want us to get caught up in some of the things that I'm going to be bringing forward as fact, because of course everyone is different and has their own preferences. All that to say is that, of course, the workforce broadly, which then impacts the workplace, is shifting. And this is to be expected because you have older generations that are retiring and you have newer generations that are maybe coming out of school, going into the trades, college, university, and are now in the workplace. So I think this is not really a surprise. But what I don't have on the slide are some of the demographic changes that exist in Canada and in BC. I have a separate screen, so I'll share some of them with you. Immigrants make up a significant part of the workplace and the workforce. And in fact, Indigenous youth are one of the growing populations across Canada. We also have growing populations of people with disabilities across Canada, and that could be for a variety of reasons. Perhaps it's linked to the aging population, but it's also linked to our widening of definitions of disability, where at one point we used to think that disability was strictly physical disability, and now we're branching out into invisible and episodic disabilities. More youth are identifying as part of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community as well, which is interesting because then, of course, you see that youth are the ones that are entering the workplace, of course. And what does that mean for supporting members of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community more concretely in the workplace? So it's to say that, of course, the ages of people in your workforce and in your workplace are going to be shifting. And that's also coupled with different dimensions of identity that we should consider because, of course, people of different ages come from all different backgrounds, nationalities, races, sexual orientations, genders, disability, and so on and so forth. If you're looking for some of the data that relates to BC or Canada more broadly on shifting demographics, please do let me know because I didn't want to pop it on the slide, but I do have a whole host of citations that I'm happy to share with you. Okay, so we're going to pivot into understanding a multi-generational workforce. We've gone through inclusion and why it matters, and we've talked a little bit about changing ages in the workplace and in the workforce. And of course, again, like I said, everything that we're going to go through in the next couple of slides are broad trends and observances, but not necessarily fact. I should say up front that each generation holds preconceptions about one another and about ourselves too. And we'll go through some of the positive and negative stereotypes that I think you've probably seen in media, or maybe you've heard between discussions of your colleagues, etc. But it's to say that we all hold biases and preconceived notions about one another and about ourselves. We also have differences in expectations, working styles, and different workplace dynamics. So we'll go over some of the expectations. For example, what are the expectations of mental health provisions in the workplace? What about organizations really demonstrating a clear commitment to inclusion? What about flexibility and work-life balance? What about structure and rigidity? What about communications? So we'll talk about all of those pieces. That brings me to the third point about communication preferences and technology usage. Are there differences in the way that the different generations enjoy being communicated with? What platforms, what kind of communication? Is it direct communication of, hey, do this by 5, done? Or is it more flexible communication of, let's have a call about it, let's discuss the goals, and then go off and try it. And if you need support, let me know. Kind of a more flexible approach. And then the last point that I want to raise before we get into some of the perspectives are that negative biases and stereotypes can absolutely lead to ageism. And of course, ageism would be a huge issue in the workplace, both from a legal perspective and a reputational perspective. So it's to say that we all have an obligation to recognize any of the biases we hold, whether they're manifesting in our actions and whether they're limiting opportunities and causing situations where we're giving some individuals opportunities and not others. I'll give you a really clear example. I've seen in job postings where, and it might be unintentional for sure, but job postings where you can tell that there is a clear preference for hiring younger individuals due to some of the terminology that's used or just preconceived notions about younger individuals being tech savvy. On the other hand, you can see this manifest in the reverse when it comes to leadership roles. And younger individuals may be overlooked for leadership roles because they are perceived as not having the experience or the skill or the knowledge to hold those roles. So you can see how in both of those instances, ageism is a factor. And of course, any bias we have leads to the stereotype, which leads to ageism. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what are the common perceptions of each generation? We have some positives and we have some negatives. Again, trends, perspectives, but I think there's some interesting binaries that come up when we're talking about the different generations. One of the big ones is really stability versus flexibility. And again, a generalization, but perhaps some of the older generations really appreciate a stable workplace where, the goals are laid out, everything's expected, there's a cadence in the day-to-day rhythm, everything is clear and outlined. Younger generations perhaps appreciate a little bit more flexibility. And I also think because of the ways that the workforce, sorry, has gone, there's a lot more contract work lately, which means that younger generations have grown up in an era where it's more difficult to get full-time permanent work. Thus, the need to always be flexible, always on the go, always on the lookout for new opportunities is actually something that may be a bit more ingrained as opposed to older generations. The idea of entitlement versus earned it yourself. I think that that's something that we see in media. I think it's something that we hear among colleagues. This idea that the older generations feel like they have stepped their way up to a leadership role and they have earned it. And perhaps there's a feeling that younger generations come into a workplace and they are entitled to provisions, opportunities, etc. And again, I'm not saying that that's an absolute truth, but I'm saying that these are some of the things that you may be hearing in your communities among your colleagues, that kind of thing, that binary. The tech savvy versus the old school binary. So this idea that younger generations are quite tech savvy, they're using AI, and older generations are the pen and paper generation. Again, that's not to say that that's entirely true, but if that's the thinking, then that manifests in our recruitment efforts, our leadership opportunities, so on and so forth. The open-minded binary versus the status quo binary. So perhaps people who have been in the workplace and the workforce for a long time have established ways that they like to do things, versus younger generations who maybe want to come in and change something or investigate a process, make it more efficient. So it's to say that you have some positives and negatives on the screen. I'll go through a couple, but those are some of the binaries that I think you can pull out when we're going through these. So maybe older generations are perceived as quite loyal to the organization, strong work ethic, but at the same time, a resistance to change because they've been working there for a while with an established process. Independent and resourceful. At the same time, younger generations maybe value career development and flexibility. They're attracted to organizations that have similar values and beliefs to them, maybe a little bit more tech savvy, but maybe also less attached to their job, wanting more work-life balance, maybe higher expectations of support in the workplace and opportunities to grow. What are some of the differences in workplace expectations? This was an interesting study that I found. It's Deloitte and it's global. So it looked at younger generations from all the various continents. And it talked about the differences in expectations when it comes to overall job satisfaction, well-being, personal beliefs. And what it shows is that Gen Z and millennials really agree that a sense of purpose is key to overall job satisfaction. And they're more likely to reject a potential employer based on their personal beliefs. They believe they have the power to drive change within an organization, and they said that they would leave their role if their colleague experienced discrimination. Now, of course, I'll be upfront and say that these are all hypotheticals. These were asked of people, would you do if XYZ? So, of course, when you're in a stable job, it's a different experience. But it's to say that millennials and Gen Zs were more likely to say these kind of things, that it's really important for them to have a sense of purpose at their job and they're looking for workplaces that align with their values. Well, why does this matter? Because, of course, then you're thinking about the recruitment and retention of diverse workforces, changing demographics, and what would resonate with younger generations and what younger generations might be looking for example, on a job posting. Would they be looking to see some of the wellness opportunities and benefits or some of the growth opportunities that exist? Now, again, that's not to say that older generations also don't value this. They absolutely do. It's just to say that this one study had shown that younger generations maybe value this a little bit more highly. Some of the nuances when it comes to mental health and wellness. And I should also say up front that, of course, we don't exist in a vacuum. A key example would be the technology that one uses in the workplace is probably reflective of the technology that they grew up with at the time. I grew up just before social media had taken off, but I had a computer, I was emailing. We just didn't have the common social media tools now. But My colleague, the founder who typically also co-delivers this with me, grew up at a different time. So she may be more accustomed to wanting to use the phone and less of the G chat method that's a quick, hey, doing this, let me know when you're done. Maybe she's more accustomed to email. So it's really that we don't live in a vacuum and we're influenced by the world around us and the time that we grew up in. When we're talking about something like mental health and wellness, you have to imagine that mental health is a relatively new conversation. I think for some of us of younger generations, we really take that for granted. And we think, well, that's not really stigmatized anymore, and we respect mental health in the same way that we respect physical health. But that's not necessarily the case. And so, valuing an employer based on the wellness and mental health provisions that they provide is something that's really a privilege. And perhaps people of older generations actually haven't had the privilege to request. They haven't been comfortable disclosing, and it hasn't been something that's been valued or seen on the same level as physical health. So it's to say that, of course, we do see some studies that show that Gen Z is particularly preoccupied with the well-being provisions that an organization provides. But that's not to say that older generations aren't as well. It's to say that perhaps a divide exists on who feels comfortable speaking out because this is maybe a newer conversation. Let's talk about communication and collaboration, and then we'll talk a little bit about AI. So, again, like I mentioned, I think this is really shaped by the context that you grew up in. We see some studies that show that older generations perhaps prefer auditory or visual communication with clear instructions. Younger generations may prefer quick texts or chats. Collaboration, maybe older generations like mentorship because it provides them an opportunity to share their expertise with younger individuals in the workplace. And younger individuals in the workplace really enjoy coaching and hands-on learning. So, here we're going to talk about in a couple of slides some strategies for supporting collaboration between individuals of different ages in the workplace. And you see that this is a real opportunity for that to happen because you can be promoting mentorship and reverse mentorship, upskilling in tech, and the different ways that people of different generations or ages can support one another in providing lived experience and processes and more hands-on learning. And of course, trends in AI usage. And I will say, so this comes from a study that we recently did. Familiarity in AI tools, I think, is also influenced by the time. Of course, AI is new, and so kids in school are learning AI and they're using it and applying it to their assignments, their tests, which would make sense as to why the younger generations have more familiarity with AI, whereas perhaps the older generations don't. That's not to say that they're not using AI, but it's to say that, of course, because a couple of slides back, I showed that older generations are retiring out of the workplace and younger generations are coming in, which is a natural pattern. You could imagine that there's lots of individuals who are coming in with some knowledge of AI. This provides an opportunity for upskilling of people who are already in the organization, I think no matter the age. Again, like I said, while I'm someone who's just in the middle of the millennial Gen Z, I'm not someone who knows a lot about AI, doing my best. So I would need upskilling even though I'm part of the younger generation. But it's to say that this really presents an opportunity for collaboration. So, reverse mentorship, hands on learning, collaboration between individuals in the organization. And it also provides an opportunity to really identify where maybe AI is not the spot that you can use to make a process more efficient, and where actually a process already works well and you don't need to automate it. Okay, before we go into ages in the workplace, let me just check in on the chat and the to make sure I'm not missing anything. I see something from Bronwyn. Yeah, a lot of pushback from younger generations on AI, which is totally valid. And I think probably because there's also a social impact and environmental impact. Again, that's not to say that older generations aren't also thinking about that. I think it may not be, my point is less about whether people like AI and more about whether or not younger generations, just because of the newness of AI, are being expected to use it or are using it on a more frequent basis in schools and thus bringing it to the workplace versus older generations. So perhaps it's just more embedded in younger generations day to day. But that's not to say that younger generations don't experience pushback with AI, perhaps myself a little bit included. There's applications, but let me see if there's anything else and then I'll keep going. So we're going to move to ageism in the workplace because, like I mentioned, of course, we're talking about some general trends and observations, but that's not set in stone and that's not fact. It's just trends, again, based on the time that people grew up in, the time that people entered the workplace in or the workforce in, and how that shaped their realities, the things that people felt like they could ask for. So, again, going back to the mental health and the work-life balance, those were things that maybe people felt like in the past they couldn't ask for, and now it's become a little bit more normalized and people can ask for it. You can also think of shifts in cost of living or supporting large families, so on and so forth, that really shapes whether people feel like they can have a strong work-life balance, whether people feel like they can ask for a different compensation. So it's to say that, again, we don't exist in a bubble or in a vacuum. Where the issue comes into play is when we're deciding about opportunities or affording some opportunities and not others because of our perspectives of the skills and qualifications they bring because of age. And I gave two examples, this idea of a young tech startup organization that puts on their job application that they're looking for a young, energetic workforce. And you may think that that is, yeah, that's a fine thing to say. But in reality, what is that signaling and how does that go into discrimination and ageism? On the flip side, when you have people in the workplace who are all striving for a leadership opportunity and you discount some of the younger members, even though they're demonstrating skills and competency, you think that they're not seasoned enough. So we see that it works in both ways. I have some screenshots on the slide that I thought were interesting. They're from the Micropedia of Microaggressions, which is actually an online resource that we've developed. And all of these came from submissions. So someone had suggested, for example, like, you're a little young to lead this project, for example. Like maybe that's something that you've heard, I've heard, people have heard, and it becomes an online submission. So all of these are real microaggressions or biases that people have experienced and heard. And I'll also say that ageism then links with other kinds of identity. I don't have it on the slide, but I do have some data on my other screen that shows that women are actually more likely to say that they've experienced ageism in the workplace than men, because you can imagine that a lot of the invalidation that women experience on the basis of gender then couples with age to say, oh, well, she's an older woman, so we can discount her opinion. Or, well, she's a younger woman, so she doesn't really know what she's talking about, right? I'm sure we've seen those things in media. Maybe we've heard them between colleagues. So again, it's to say observations lead to negative biases and stereotypes, which leads to action, which leads to ageism. Oh, I have a little bit of data. Okay, so here we go. Women are more likely to report ageism in the workplace compared to men, and members of different equity deserving communities, so people with disability, Indigenous people, racialized, and members of the 2S LGBTQ plus community also report more ageism because you can see that ageism then couples with other forms of discrimination. So, what are we going to do about it? I'll pause here and see if there's anything. I know I said I was going to leave the questions to the chat, but I just want to make sure. To the end, sorry. Okay, I think we're good. So what are we going to do about it? I'm going to offer you some strategies of how you can support a multi-generational workplace. I'll talk about some systemic, broad organizational things, and then I'll get into some more interpersonal dynamics. So maybe it's peer-to-peer or maybe it's manager-to-peer, of how we're going to support people of different ages. The one thing I really want to highlight is that oftentimes we think of inclusion as only existing in human resource processes. And HR processes are a big piece of the pie for sure, a big part of the puzzle, I guess, because it relates to your hiring, your recruitment, your retention, your promotion. So that's key. But it's also to say that inclusion exists across all organizational processes. You can think of leadership and setting strategy and tone from the top, values and culture, and that's anything that exists in a workplace, like whether people feel valued and respected. Measurement and tracking, so whether people are using your services and feel like they meet their needs, disaggregated by different ages. Whether you have people of all different ages working in the workplace and whether they feel valued. Diversity across the value chain really relates to services, marketing, whether your communications are accessible and inclusive. And outreach and expanding the pool. So think of any partnerships you have with organizations. Who are those organizations? Are there opportunities to make partnerships with organizations that are led by people of different ages to bring those perspectives back to the workplace? So again, it's to say that HR does have a really strong role to play in inclusion, but it's not the only lever for change. I'll go through some of the more organizational pieces quickly because I want to get to the meat and potatoes of this section, which I think is really some of the more interpersonal dynamics around challenging stereotypes, inclusive communications, what to do if perhaps there's a status quo and there's a change or a challenge to the status quo. But if we're starting with processes, I think the first place to start is leadership, governance, and strategy. And a webinar like this is a great example. I think it sets tone from the top in recognizing that you have a multi-generational workplace and a multi-generational workforce. You have people of all different ages who are collaborating and coinciding. And what are we going to do to support them? Leadership should be responsible with modeling inclusive behaviors and actions, establishing inclusive practices across the organization, and really linking inclusion to the organization's priorities, mission, vision, and values. I had a quick look at some of the strategic plans of the organizers, and I think there's really clear ways to slot inclusion into all of the strategic priorities because they link to a workplace and a workforce that's supportive and services that are supportive as well. And I think leadership also does have a responsibility to support managers with capacity building and other strategies for managers to support a multi-generational team. Because I think often what happens is we talk so much to the leadership and then we talk to the staff, but we miss this kind of like middle rung management who are really key in shaping the day-to-day experiences of staff. And so leadership should be setting the tone to managers to say, like, this is what we expect, and here are some tools and strategies for you to implement these expectations so that managers are creating inclusive teams. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in upcoming slides. Human resource processes, of course, a big piece of the pie. We're thinking of age inclusive recruitment. So it really starts with your job postings and your job design, really thinking of the skills you need. And I'll pick on AI because I think that's what I've talked about a lot today. And of course, I do think that there's applications for it for sure. But think about whether when you're writing up a job posting, if you're writing something like needs to be really well versed in XYZ tech, la la la, when you actually don't need all that. You just need someone who can work with Google Suite. Sometimes I find that we try to make our posting so eloquent and over the top because we're, of course, looking for someone that would have 20 plus competencies. But it's about being tangible and realistic to what you actually need in the workplace so that people don't weed themselves out of an opportunity. Reviewing job postings for age neutral language. I gave an example earlier, but even saying things like we're looking for a mature, seasoned individual, a young, energetic individual, or, we are a mature, seasoned organization. We are a young, energetic organization. I think that's another way that people try to spin it by talking about the organization like it's a person in the hopes of attracting a certain kind of demographic. Focusing on competencies over age and also perhaps over length of time. I wonder about, and I've worked with a lot of organizations where we've investigated this. Sometimes it's that you need someone who's had 10 years experience in the nonprofit world. But what happens if you have a great candidate and they have 7? I think it's about ensuring that you're selecting someone who's able to demonstrate the skills and competencies that you need and not focusing too much on the years of experience. Of course, again, that really depends because I understand some people are in healthcare or some people are in sectors where that is really needed. But it's to say offering a little bit of flexibility and really looking at your job postings from that lens is key. Wellness supports, flexible working arrangements, support for mental health and well-being, and in addition to providing the provisions, actually promoting them and ensuring that people are comfortable to take them on. We know that, of course, from a couple of slides earlier, that younger generations are perhaps more likely to prioritize their health and well-being and expect work-life balance provisions. But that's to say that everyone should be encouraged to take these, particularly older generations who maybe haven't felt empowered to take these in the past. In the same way that I think when it comes to parental leave, it's often the expectation that women are going to take maternity leave in the workplace. That's the societal norm and expectation. And oftentimes I'll see organizations that have paternity or parental leave, but it's that men are not taking it because the culture still isn't inviting for them to take it. And so it needs to be coupled with communications from managers and leadership, encouraging people to take these supports that are available. And then training and development. Here we have some great opportunities for upskilling, and that could be on the tech side, but it could be on processes that more seasoned individuals in the workplace hold and have that they could be supporting younger generations with. Multimodal delivery of training and cross-generational and tailored mentorship. So again, if there's a process that's been implemented in an organization for a long time that people really feel is working and is efficient, how can some of the people who have been in that organization for a while support people who are new and coming into the workplace? I kind of think this is important regardless of age. And how can some of the individuals who are bringing new and maybe more innovative ideas to the workplace support upskilling of people who have been there longer? Again, I kind of think that is regardless of age. So there's some general HR processes that support recruitment, development, and wellness. Then we'll go into managing a multi-generational workforce. And then I think, yeah, I have some slides that talk a little bit about interpersonal dynamics. If you're someone on the line who is a manager and you have maybe one staff or multiple staff, no matter how many staff you are, I think it's really key for you to establish a process early on to understand who your staff are. And of course, like I said, I shared with you some observations that exist in the literature and the research of people of different generations. But frankly, everyone's different. And I would have this slide no matter the session I was delivering, whether it be gender equality, anti-Black racism, or multi-generational workforces. It's key that when you're onboarding new staff, that you take the time to understand who they are, what their strengths are, and what their areas for improvement are. How do they like to be communicated with? I have some staff that prefer to share a weekly update in writing with me via email as their update. Fantastic. I have other staff who like to send a quick blast over GChat. I'm working on this, touch base with you at this time. Great. I try to tailor as their manager my communications to them to meet what works best for them. What is also the best way for people to get feedback? Some people like to send me a document, I'll track change it, and they look at the track changes, and that's how they learn. They learn by seeing and by doing. Other people want feedback to be provided verbally. And so maybe we'll have a conversation about what's working well in the report and what can be improved. I think that really also comes with, like I said, strong onboarding processes, but also regular one-on-ones with your team to continuously ensure that the support you're providing is working for them. Also, the support that they're providing to you is working for you, right? It's a two-way street and it's a collaboration. And in all of this, really also ensuring that you and your staff have common goals that you're working towards and reiterating those. So I think it's about establishing expectations, common goals, and understandings of one another early on, and then having regular touch points or one-on-ones to enforce those, identify what continues to work well and what can be shifted. And again, I would say that no matter the kind of content I'm delivering for a session, but I do think that that would really help with a multi-generational workforce and all of the different needs and communication preferences and styles that exist across the generations. I have a couple more slides and then we'll go into some conversation. Just on some interpersonal pieces, we'll first start with addressing biases and assumptions. So at the top, and I think you'll see this framework for the next maybe like 4 to 5-ish slides. At the top, we have the challenge, and on the bottom, we have the strategies for what we can do about it. So, like we said, I think there are preconceived notions about people of all different ages and the different categories or the generations that exist broadly in the media, but also in the workplace. So stereotypes, assumptions about technology, commitment, and adaptability. It's not just about tech, it's about some people feeling like maybe people of certain ages are less committed to their work because they strive for work-life balance than others. Again, that comes from the context we live in at the time. Age-related barriers to training, promotion, and participation. This feeling like perhaps older generations, like they are already established in their process and don't need training, and thus as a workplace, we maybe don't upskill or support, which I think is a form of limitation and ageism. What can we do about it? I think first and foremost, it's about focusing on individual strengths rather than labels, which I know is a little bit wild because we just went through some of the labels on a couple of slides back, but focusing on individual strengths, which really goes back to what I said here about trying to understand your staff or your colleagues early on and then keeping that relationship going. You're going to challenge age-related stereotypes whenever they arise. Key example, you're on a hiring panel, or you have a colleague who's younger who's going for a leadership opportunity, and hear someone say, I think we'd be better placed with someone more seasoned. That's a great spot to interject and maybe bring it back to the skills and competencies you need for the role and whether this person fits the bill. Ensuring equitable access to training and development to really break this divide of some people are good at this and other people are good at this based on their age. I think a key way to break down biases and assumptions is to foster collaboration across people. And I would say this no matter, again, the training topic. Collaboration and understanding a person's perspective and where they're coming from is really key to breaking down perceptions and preconceived notions. So, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to training and development. But any opportunity you as a manager or you as a colleague can bring people together and encourage people to lean on one another and learn from one another is an opportunity for people to break down their assumptions about one another. Let me see if there's anything before I continue. Okay. Supporting different communication styles. So, some of the challenges that we see, frankly, different communication styles. Some people are way more direct, some people are discussion focused. Again, I think that can shift based on generations, but I think it also can shift just based on the person. Different feedback expectations. We talked about how some people want to see your feedback in written form. Some people want to have a discussion about it. Some people may take feedback a little bit more personally than others. And differences in preferences of communication channels. Like I mentioned, some team members may use email. Some team members talk a lot in meetings, others don't. Some people want to send a quick G-chat. So, what can we do to support this? I said at the very beginning of this session that flexibility, I think, is going to be the name of the game. So here I think it is about that flexibility. But first, if you're communicating to your staff or to your colleagues, you're going to think to yourself, what is the goal of this communication? For example, am I providing an update that we're going to be closed on Friday for all staff training? So I don't really need people's feedback on it. I'm just communicating an update. Am I communicating because we're going to change our process and incorporate AI into the way that we track client emails? And I kind of want a change management perspective where I'm going to seek people's feedback. And that bleeds into the new process. Am I offering something new to the organization or to my team that I think maybe people will have different perspectives on? So you're going to outline like the purpose of the communication and the overall goal. You're going to tailor your communication to different audiences. So realizing, and I understand that sometimes you can't have a different comms for each person, totally. But think about how your comms might be received from people of different ages or roles or identities in the organization. If you're introducing an entirely new process, how might people who have been there for a long time receive that? And what are some of the ways that you can ease some of those concerns or invite them into the conversation? So whatever communications you put out should have some thinking of how these people might receive it. And then your communication speaks to that a little bit. So we're not going to change the process entirely. We're still going to leverage Salesforce, which you're all familiar with, to do ABC. We're going to implement AI to automate this one particular part of the process. Would love if you all tried it out for a week or two and come back to me with any pain points. I think that eases the people who have been there for a long time, for example. Ensure accessible and inclusive language and comms. That's anything like in Ontario, we have AODA. Regulations, but contrast, font, format, the kind of language you're using, and whether it has ageist undertones. Select the best channel for your communication and adjust as needed. So something like a quick update, maybe it's something that you post in your Slack channel. I don't know what you use, but Slack, GChat, you move on. Something that is a little bit more robust, maybe it goes in an email or a memo, or it's a conversation. You want anyone who's a manager to be able to adapt their communication styles, which again goes to flexibility. And you want to ensure two-way communication, active listening, and opportunities for clarification. So anytime that you're communicating something and you want to foster dialogue, you upfront encourage people to listen to understand rather than listen to rebuttal. You encourage people to share their perspective and to learn from one another, and to see different sides of the coin. And again, that goes back to my previous slide on addressing biases and assumptions. When people better understand where they're coming from, they're better placed to make relationships and then avoid stereotypes. But those are some of the ways that you can support different communication styles. Balancing experience with updated standards. And I kind of gave an example of this when I talked about comms and sharing about a new process. But some of the challenges might be like, this is how we've always done something. We're not interested in changing it. Or a new staff, and I think this can be age related, but also not really, comes in and wants to challenge established practices. I think key here is involving experienced staff in the implementation of new processes. If you're in a situation where it's kind of like a this is how we've already done it mindset. So if you want to introduce something new, involve people in the process, especially those who may be a little bit more in favor of existing processes. I think no matter the age, you explain the rationale behind the change. Maybe it's going to enhance productivity, maybe it's going to cut costs, whatever it is. Create opportunities for shared learning. Here's a great opportunity for upskilling, reskilling, mentorship, reverse mentorship, hands-on learning. Even if you're going to do some kind of workshop where I just was in one today, for example, you're going to do some kind of workshop on event planning because that's what I was in. The groups make sure that they're diverse people of different ages and backgrounds in the groups, that people feed off of one another and they hear the different pain points and ideas from other people. And invite feedback on processes. Consider what works in practice and what doesn't. So allow people to have time to think about a process, work on it, and then come back to you with their perspectives. I think this ensures that people who are a bit more seasoned in the workplace feel heard and valued, and people who are a bit newer who want change also feel heard and valued. Support with technology. I think you're seeing a theme here that it's really about providing hands-on opportunities, multiple learning formats, whether it's peer coaching, guides, videos, leveraging people who are maybe champions of the effort in the workplace to provide peer learning, and focusing on the benefits. So here we're talking a little bit more about like AI or new tech that you're introducing, but that can go in any direction, like any new process that you want to establish, just making sure that people feel comfortable. I should also say, going back to this slide, that when we're talking about processes and standards, sometimes it's not that you're introducing something new. Sometimes it's that you're going to stick with what you know. And that's totally fine. The same approaches apply. Why are we sticking with what we know? What are the benefits? How can we train people in the existing process to bring them up to speed? How can we learn from our different perspectives? And then ensuring that people have opportunities to ask questions. I think I've got, yeah, 2 more slides. Promoting healthy boundaries and preventing burnout. So, challenges, different workplace boundaries and expectations. We talked earlier about some of the differences across the generations and how maybe older generations have been expected to push through given the times. Younger generations may be more accustomed to asking for work-life balance or expecting work-life balance. And broadly, I think just compassion and fatigue, a compassion for fatigue and burnout overall, no matter the generation. But realizing that there's nuances here. And if you're a colleague or a manager, not assuming that, someone who's younger and who's asking for this kind of compassion, well, they're entitled, or, oh, older generations don't need it because they're not asking, right? I think if you're a manager, it's really clear to model the kind of behaviors you expect. So something that I'm trying to get better at is when I'm off, I'm actually off because I think that models to the team that when they're off, they're also expected to be off. Respecting scheduling boundaries whenever possible, encouraging people to use benefits and wellness supports. We talked about that earlier. Training leaders and managers to recognize early signs of burnout. So maybe people not being able to complete tasks on time or pushback on tasks or assignments that's, you're not feeling like it's coming from pushback because they're not enjoying the task, but for another reason. It's also your responsibility to know what's on people's plate and then to delegate accordingly. Regularly scheduling one-on-one meetings with employees to understand what they need. And also, of course, like I said, sustainable workload for all people. And then my last one is really fostering respect across the generation. And this actually goes back to the very first slide I had in this pink section on addressing biases, stereotypes, microaggressions, so on and so forth. Here's some of the challenges or expectations versus, different definitions of expectations, seniority versus new perspectives, and experience versus education. And you've heard me say it again before, but I'll say it again. creating opportunities for intergenerational learning, so the transfer of knowledge, encouraging mentorship and reverse mentorship. Even when I joined this team, the previous director had a buddy system that she used. And it was not really necessarily grouping people based on the fact that they're exactly alike, but there was actually a logic for people who are different so that we could learn from one another. Recognize both lived experience and formal education, and that exists in job postings and recruitment and hiring and leadership opportunities. But it also exists in your day-to-day work. So maybe someone comes to the table with really long lived experience on a particular process and someone else doesn't, but it's important to hear both parties out to better have a fulsome understanding of what could work and what could be possible. Celebrating the perspectives and contributions of people and all their diversity of all ages in the workplace, and modeling respectful behaviors that you expect to see in the workplace. That is my last slide, and I think I'm on time for a couple of questions, but I'll just wrap up by saying that, of course, we heard a lot from me about different expectations or roles or trends multi-generationally in the workplace. And again, I think the challenge that comes in is when we start affording people different opportunities based on those assumptions, which then, of course, goes into ageism. It's always good to understand some of the different reasons why people of different ages maybe have expectations, act the way they do, ask for support, don't ask for support. And overall flexibility is really the name of the game, and supporting people based on your understanding of age, but also based on the individual's needs, no matter their age. So I hope that helped, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Yeah, so I see there are a couple questions in the chat and one in the Q&A here. You kind of touched on this, but maybe you could elaborate a bit more. Do you have recommended responses to this ageism commentary to reframe it to be more inclusive?
Yes, I do. And I don't know, maybe you want to private chat me with an example. I gather that what you're asking is like maybe you've heard something ageist in the workplace and how you can reframe it. Um, I mean, I think there's lots of I think micro affirmations are a good tool. And I'm trying to think of a good example to give you, but a micro affirmation is essentially where you take the negative thing that's been said and flip it into a positive. So, one that comes to mind related to race is when people say, like, oh, you're so articulate. I wouldn't have expected that you're so articulate. And then they say that to, colleague. And then you say, that was an excellent presentation, Mike. We're so happy to have you on the team. Like you did a really great job. So you've almost flipped it on its head. But I do think also calling these things out is important. I can think of it specifically in the hiring or recruitment process, where if you did hear something like, well, we're kind of a tech startup and this person is an older individual, I'm not sure they're the right fit. I don't think you need to use some fancy micro affirmation. I think you can say something like, well, why wouldn't they be a good fit? It seems like they have the good skills and qualifications. It's good to have different perspectives on the team. Let's consider them. So I think you really have to read the room and see whether you're going to take some kind of like micro affirmation approach of flipping it on its head, or whether you're going to take the approach of stating a fact as a fact.
There was a question. Have you noticed any generational differences in attitudes towards participating in return to work or accommodation processes when individuals have an illness or injury?
Hmm. Um, Yeah, I would say I can't give a great answer for that because I haven't looked into any of the research on it, and anything I say would be a little bit more anecdotal. But what I would say is probably there is some situation happening where younger generations I mean, we existed during the pandemic, and so we now saw that there are opportunities for this flexibility, and we realized that like organizations can do this. Plus, now you have a heightened emphasis on accommodation, accessibility, mental health supports, work-life balance, and so younger generations are maybe more accustomed to asking for that and being upfront with their needs, whereas older generations may not, and as a result, a little bit more pushback on like return to work policies. But I don't have any research on it to back that up.
We'll do this one last one before I mention some of our upcoming sessions. Someone is just talking about the possibility of Gen Z having higher expectations because they're prone to demand change when they see injustice, which I guess
Yes.
you were speaking on, not saying that other generations did not want to change things, but maybe their environment did not allow them to speak.
Totally. Yeah. And even like complementary to that, I was doing some research on consumer attitudes, and younger generation consumers are more likely to hold a brand accountable for their sustainability practices or their anti-racism policies. So it seems like a broader trend among younger generations. But again, that's not to say that older generations don't. To your point, Carissa, it just might now be more socially acceptable for you to say, hey, like, what are your wellness supports? Or what are your growth opportunities? That kind of thing. Whereas it might not have been socially acceptable before.